All right. Hello, everyone. It is 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, maybe a little bit later in the day, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome here. This webinar is entitled The Varied Landscapes of Women's Church Experiences, and we are going to be hearing today from Lindsay Callaway. My name is Katie Steves, and I'm the Associate Professor of Sociology at Trinity Western University, and also Associate Director of Research at the Flourishing Congregations Institute. This is the fourth webinar in our series of 4 this academic year, which focus in different ways on some of the internal markers of congregational flourishing. Today, we're hearing from Lindsay, who will begin with a 20-minute presentation, and we are very fortunate to have a 15-minute conversationalist afterwards, a 15-minute commentator through Aaron Knott today. Just a brief background now and some information about our speakers. Lindsay Callaway is a senior researcher at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada and the lead researcher on a national study on women in the Canadian Evangelical Church, examining how Canadian women understand their roles and participate in local congregations. She has a master's degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in systematic theology and bioethics. And when she's not working, you can usually find her playing Catan with her husband or getting one of her 3 children a snack. Aaron Knott is the Assistant Director, District Superintendent, Executive Administration and Governance for the Canadian Pacific District of the Alliance Church Canada. The Alliance Canada. She has a background in church ministry and health information management and is currently completing a master's in Christian leaders at Trinity Western University. When she is not working, you can find her reading a good book, enjoying a cup of tea with a friend, or somewhere close to the ocean. So following the conversation with Aaron today, we'll open up the floor for 10 minutes of Q&A. And then if you wish, you are invited to stay after that for a 15-minute conversation where members of the Partnership Council or the research team who are presenting here today will moderate a time of discussion and networking in smaller groups based on today's webinar. A few logistics. We are recording this webinar and will make it available afterwards. If you wish to raise a question for discussion after the presentation, please insert it into the Q&A text box, which can be accessed by pressing the Q&A button at the top of your screen. So that will be where we will be gathering our questions today, and I'll refer to the questions put there when it is time for that discussion a little bit later in our time together. So please place your questions there rather than in the chat. Now, without further delay, let's hand it over to Lindsay Callaway to hear about this important research.
Thank you so much, Katie. All right, well, for the past 2.5 years, a research partnership of 14 evangelical affiliates comprised of denominations, theological institutions, and ministry organizations gathered around the question, how do Canadian evangelical women understand their roles and participate in the local church? Now, to answer this question, we designed a mixed methods research study that consisted of literature review, 25 key informant interviews with women and men, nominated by research partners, 49 semi-structured qualitative interviews with women recruited from partner networks, and then a national survey accumulated through snowball sampling through EFC and partner networks that returned 2,075 valid responses. So it's important to remember that this study utilized an opt-in digital survey, which limits the ability to generalize findings to the entire female Canadian evangelical population. But the scale of the response, with over 2,000, does provide an uncommonly deep look into this demographic. So many themes emerged from our data that will be released next week in our final report. It's called the National Study on Women in Canadian Evangelical Churches. But before I dive into some of the central themes, I want to address some of the theological nuances to this conversation. So in Western conversations, sorry, let me just get that up there. In Western conversations, discussions of women in the church, they're typically framed in terms of complementarian and egalitarian. Now, I emphasize Western because women in our samples were less likely to use these labels if they were visible minorities or had significant global ministry experience. So for them, culture, age, marital status, those shaped their experiences more strongly than these categories. Now, complementarian generally refers to contexts where certain offices and functions in the church are differentiated by gender, often reserving the highest offices and authority for qualified men. And then egalitarian describes contexts where women and men may assume all ecclesial offices and functions irrespective of gender. And just a note, we didn't talk about marriage in our conversation, so sometimes these terms apply to the home, sometimes not. We just focused on the church. Now, these two terms tend to be widely used, debated, supported by biblical argumentation within evangelicalism. Yet in our research, we saw remarkable inconsistency between the theological labels informants used, or the ones they avoided, and the practices in their churches. So, for example, one male pastor, a self-identified complementarian, he incorporated women into the Sunday preaching rotation. Meanwhile, other complementarian women insisted that they had no desire to preach or to lead men. And some complementarians restricted male headship to the home and the church, while others extended it to be a universal social principle. And one woman in a small Reformed church said that women served and felt valued, even though they couldn't hold any offices in their denomination. But she saw no barriers to her service or her impact in the church. Now, on the egalitarian side of things, women in historically egalitarian denominations, they encountered barriers to their advancement. They encountered unequal pay or cultural expectations that restricted their leadership. So one Pentecostal woman ordained serving as a pastor said that her leadership was only acceptable when her husband co-pastored beside her. Another woman in a holiness denomination said, quote, "Women are getting jobs in churches, most of them unpaid. When our denominational leaders celebrate how many women were ordained, I will publicly ask how many of them are gainfully employed and receiving health insurance," close quote. So these examples are just supposed to show you that complementarianism and egalitarianism don't necessarily present as neat and tidy case studies. So had we limited our assumptions about practice to this language, to these terms alone, then we believe that the realities of belief and practice would have been obscured. Now, adding to the complexity is that few of our interview informants used or defined these terms in interviews, even though they may have selected them on our screener. So to make sure we were speaking with women from a range of perspectives on the roles of women in the church, we asked about these labels on a demographic screener, but then we intentionally avoided overtly biblical or theological language in our interviews. So we were hoping that informants would naturally appeal to these terms or appeal to their own reasoning, whether biblically based or otherwise. And our approach was informed by research from Sam Reimer, interacting with work by Drs. Abby Day and Anna Strawn. Reimer writes that when evangelicals say they believe something, believes often serve the function of signaling allegiance and belonging to a group. It's a way to show and reinforce one's identity. So what we encountered in interviews versus what informants put on the screener was telling. For example, one Gen Z woman who selected complementarian on the screener then said in her interview, I realized just how I'm not fully cemented on my belief on that. I'm still trying to figure it out, end quote. And so she had the option to choose. I'm still working through this. Let me just show you this is what they had the option to select from on their screeners. And she had the option to choose, I'm still working through this, but she chose complementarian, likely because the term was familiar in her circles. So she never used the term in her interview. And then, so we suspected she selected it on the screener to kind of signal her church's stance rather than express her own personally formed conviction. Another informant who selected complementarian for herself on the screener said that she was a soft complementarian. And then when asked what that meant, she replied that she had not looked into the topic deeply, but believed men and women had different roles with overlap, which included female deacons and the possibility of female elders. So again, we wondered why she chose complementarian on the screener when still working through this may have been a more accurate representation. Now, because of this informant, we actually added the category of somewhere in between on our survey, which ended up representing 17% of our survey sample. Now, in another case, an informant selected egalitarian on the screener and said God gives gifts indiscriminately in her interview, yet she did make an exception for the lead pastor role. And then another informant was a lead pastor in a non-denominational charismatic church, and she selected, I'm still working through this. Even though her Pentecostal background and her pastoral leadership role would suggest she's an egalitarian, she was adamant, however, about male headship in the home. So in summary, while these terms are widely accepted, our research showed that they do not tell the whole story of women's convictions in the church. So complementarian and egalitarian responses accounted for only 47% of participants. And 17% identified as in between, 5% said they're still working through their position, 9% found the terms unhelpful, and 19% were just unfamiliar with them altogether. And then the remaining 3% said other or didn't respond. Second is that these terms do not translate to consistent practices in the local church. So people using the same label described different expectations and practices regarding women's participation, regarding family, society. So it just makes these terms unreliable predictors of how women actually serve. And moreover, no denomination or tradition in our survey was composed entirely of one view or the other. So that means within most congregations, people likely hold a blend of convictions while serving and worshiping side by side. Now, this chart I have here is more broad by tradition, but here is the chart by individual denominations. And I actually couldn't fit all of the denominations, but you'll see that even if one group might sway toward one side or the other, there's really, it's a pretty good 50-50 split about who's actually using the terms complementarian or egalitarian. It's really only half the story. So with that explained, I'd like to pull out 6 key findings from our research with the time I have left, and you'll be able to dive into other themes and flesh out the ones that I cover today and the ones that I don't cover today in the full report, but I'll just highlight a few today. So first, let's look at the Bible. Across our survey sample, women demonstrated a high degree of theological alignment with the core tenets of evangelical Christianity. More than 99% affirmed the belief in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and then 98% agreed the Bible is the authoritative word of God. So these numbers exist alongside notable differences in how scripture is interpreted. So interviews revealed that there are 2 main lenses for interpretation when it came especially to the roles of women in the church. Some informants focused on texts that they understood to be more about structure, like 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Corinthians 14, and they used those to evaluate other biblical texts. Others focused on texts that they understood to be about gifting, calling, and freedom in Christ, like Ephesians 4 or 1 Corinthians 12 or Galatians 3. And they used these as interpretive lenses. So each group used their lens or their frame of reference to understand the rest of the Bible. So each group is holding up the authority of the Bible, but they apply different lenses to it. At the same time, women in the survey expressed strong confidence in their interpretive conclusions about scripture, particularly regarding women's participation in the local church. Overall, 76% reported that they had clear understanding of how scripture informs women's roles. It was framed negatively on the survey, so we're looking at the disagrees on this chart. And then nearly 3/4 also indicated that they had engaged with other interpretations about women's roles in the church. And so broken down by stances on women. I don't know if I included that one here. I didn't. So so about 3/4 said, yes, I've looked into this, and I've even engaged with views that I ultimately rejected. Now, interview data complicates some of these self-assessments. So when asked to describe how they studied the topic, respondents characterized their engagement as quite limited, often consisting of a single overview from a YouTube video or a popular level book, despite initially asserting that they had done their research. So survey figures might reflect confidence in one's interpretation more than, say, a sustained engagement with competing biblical arguments. Next, the social imaginary. So as I mentioned, the findings in our study emerged from interviews, survey data, and engagement with existing scholarship on women's participation in church life. And evident in these data sources is that women's experiences and self-understanding are shaped by a complex mix of theology, of church structure, of leadership culture, personal calling, life stage, personal preferences. So as a result, local church participation cannot be understood through a single framework, but rather through overlapping influences. And they vary across denominational, cultural, and local church contexts. And they're influenced by the way you were raised, what you saw your mother doing, what you saw women doing in your church. And we describe this unique interaction of influences to be a social imaginary. Now, social imaginary is a term used by Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, referring to the way that a given people describe and understand their life and relationship with others. So he describes it as, quote, the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations, close quote. So what's important about the social imaginary is that people do not principally come to their beliefs through reasoning, but through their shared ideas about what social life, or in our case, church life, is like. So a social imaginary is not the sum of rational arguments or good exegesis. These are deemed plausible insofar as a social imaginary makes room for them. For example, in our sample, the plausibility of women in pastoral roles tended to parallel whether a person had grown up with women in such roles or not, instead of stemming primarily from theological conviction. So in other words, the majority of women in interviews developed their conclusions about women's participation in the church beyond mere interaction and deduction from biblical texts. And we found the social imaginary to be a helpful, encompassing explanatory factor that not only accounted for a person's interpretation of scripture, but also their context and even their preferences and their temperament. Generational shifts. Now, because of our large sample, we were able to make many observations by generation. And our interview questions also prompted informants to comment on generational changes that they've seen with regard to women's church participation. And most women we interviewed recognized clear generational differences in women's roles within evangelical churches. They often measured change against their mothers or grandmothers. So older women reflected on the shifts from hands-on or behind-the-scenes ministry to platformed ministry. And they noted that women's work was once more domestic and collective, like sewing baby jackets for missions or holding ladies' teas. Though more women now lead worship or usher or preach, some informants felt that this change was still limited. One boomer informant, the quote is on the screen, said, "We, our church, have more women in public faith and worship leading than it would have been a generation ago. But my takeaway was that, wow, in a generation, we really haven't changed that much." Younger women, on the other hand, emphasized shifts in representation and visibility. A millennial leader in a Christian organization reflected, again, the quote is on the screen, "When my mom was my age, there were no female senior leaders. Hopefully I'm a symbol for some people to see. It's really hard when you can't see someone who is what you think God's calling you to be." That's that social imaginary piece again. Her comment highlights how visibility itself reshapes a social imaginary for what feels possible for women. And then another major generational and cultural shift is the development of skills useful for the church, which are learned in professional settings. Older women credited women's ministry organizations for developing their leadership and organizational abilities that they might not have otherwise gained. Gen X and millennial women increasingly acquired similar skills through secular workplaces or educational settings. Some women suggested that their church continues to value women's homemaking skills, though, more than their professional expertise. So sometimes there's this mismatch between women's evolving capacities and institutional needs or expectations. And then several informants noted that juggling paid employment and unpaid domestic labor left little margin in their lives for serving in the church. So one woman reflected, quote, "I probably would have had more time to give the church if I were staying home with my children," close quote. Another noted that women who were retired had more representation on the leadership councils at her church, pointing to how demanding jobs can keep people out of church service. A male pastor informant said that women's narrowed margin had fundamentally changed the assumptions about the volunteer base in his church, saying that they had to revisit their volunteer model for their summer vacation Bible school ministry. Now, in terms of church participation, women were active in the life of their churches across generations, but the shape of that participation can vary by age. So older generations remain most engaged in small groups, prayer, care ministries, and hospitality, where younger women, by contrast, showed higher involvement in worship teams, youth ministry, technology, and event planning. Now, the survey instrument asked about women's current church involvement, so it could not accurately reflect the breadth of service that individual women give to the church over time. However, findings did show that women's participation changed with life stage across the sample. And of course, interviews gave us a lot more insight into the contours of service over time. Next, safety. In our interviews, the concept of safety emerged as a central theme, and descriptions of safety most often followed questions about how women felt valued in their communities as women. And as informants spoke, they mentioned belonging, trust, and participation, identifying forms of safety that extended beyond mere protection from physical harm to include these principles of care, respect, and relational accountability. Now, women's ideas about safety were consistent with established psychological research, wherein safety was less about lack of resilience or weakness, but more about ensuring individuals feel valued and important to the life of a given community. In this sense, safety was understood not as the absence of difficulty, but as the presence of communal trust and responsibility. Organizational psychology names psychological safety as, quote, perceptions that an individual within a team is supported and feels safe to take interpersonal risks, voice opinions, and share ideas, end quote. Identifying psychological safety as very vital for organizational effectiveness and sustainability. And we saw this play out with one informant who shared how she didn't know how to relate to her church community because of her questions. Quote, she said, to me, being able to have growth, it comes with questions, right? Being able to question how we do things traditionally, always looking at the Bible for those answers. And I feel like I made people uncomfortable when I do that, end quote. We learned from interviews that it mattered to individuals that they could be vulnerable and share personal information while trusting that their dignity would be safeguarded. It meant trusting that a community could handle an individual as they are and not just as someone the group could benefit from. Safety was also discussed in its traditional sense, meaning protection from physical harm. Informants spoke very positively about their church's hypervigilance to avoid physical harm to children and vulnerable persons, even when it demanded something from them. A few people mentioned plan to protect programs. A more consistent theme in our data, however, was that church communities often lacked the skills to recognize and respond to women who lived in or experienced unsafe circumstances. And then when a harm occurred, its early warning signs were often missed or spiritualized away. And this is by the church community. So when church communities fail to perceive or respond to signs of abuse, the harm does not remain in the relational or physical realm alone. It's also theological. So doctrines about marriage, submission, or even perseverance can often be presented without nuance or caution, which unintentionally reinforces patterns of abuse by making women feel morally obligated to endure suffering or convinced that leaving would constitute spiritual failure. And even things like attendance and cheerful participation in congregational life, it can easily act as an allusion to the lived situation of a church member. And we found a few cases like that in our interviews. Next is policy and practice. Differences in stated church beliefs and their daily practice reveal an important reality for understanding women's participation. So what churches and individuals say about gender is not necessarily reflected in action. And this often leads to frustration, unmet expectations, and complacency. Now, women in vocational ministry were particularly sensitive to the inconsistencies between professed belief and practice. For them, the discrepancies not only affected their ministry opportunities, but also their livelihoods. At the same time, women without vocational or leadership responsibilities and aspirations, they were less concerned about doctrinal precision and more attuned to just whether they felt heard or encouraged in their local contexts. So this often means that women without vocational aspirations in the church, they won't notice or they may not advocate for the same things that maybe women in vocational ministry are hoping that they would advocate for. So it's not as simple as just saying like, oh, well, so-and-so doesn't have any issues, so I'm sure your situation is fine. It's just, we have to understand that women are often coming from different perspectives, whether they're in ministry or not. And as I've stated, labels like complementarian and egalitarian in and of themselves do not reliably predict church practices occurring on the ground. So when these labels are used, our data suggests that they function less as precise theological descriptors and more as performative signals within broader public and institutional debates. But what mattered most for women Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. What mattered most for women was not always whether a church claimed to be complementarian or egalitarian, but whether their day-to-day practices of the church not only gave them access to participation, but then agency and influence. So in short, labels might declare a position, but the practices of the community reveal whether those stated policies are genuinely lived out. Finally, in closing, we believe that by listening closely to women's lived experiences, this research provides insight into current patterns of participation and emerging trends, which offers churches a clearer understanding of how women's engagement is changing across generations and what this may signal for the future vitality of congregational life. It also offers an invitation. What can be learned by sitting down and speaking with women about what they think about their church? Surveys are fairly one-dimensional, so it's easy to look at a few agreement scales and conclude that most women are satisfied. But in interviews, when we dug deeper and we got past the pleasantries, women thought deeply about their churches and had ideas about how they could improve and strengthen. So in the survey, we asked frequently attending women where they exercised influence in their local churches. And across the board, women reported exercising informal influence rather than providing like a formal consultation or playing a key role in any official capacity. And so this tells us that women's insights are solicited, but often without corresponding agency over the outcomes. So the study helps identify obstacles to and opportunities for women's involvement that are often obscured by abstract debates. Rather than locating challenges solely in theological disagreement, the findings show that participation is frequently shaped by things like relational trust, invitation, safety, and the alignment or misalignment between stated beliefs and daily practices. The research invites churches to look beyond labels and examine how their cultures, structures, and informal norms help or hinder ministry to women and with women for the health of the whole church. So as I said, the National Study on Women in Canadian Evangelical Churches will be available on Monday. We're very excited about that. And you can find it at thefc.ca/women-in-church. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I know if we were together in person, you would be hearing the applause that folks maybe indicate emoji-wise in a virtual setting. I'm very pleased now to hand things over to Erin for her response. And just a reminder, you can put questions in the Q&A box anytime as they occur to you. Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Katie. And thank you to you too, Lindsay. I'm grateful to be here today. I really want to express my deep gratitude to the entire research team and the partnership group for their work. I think that we honor Christ when, as a larger church, we work together in unity for the flourishing of all. And so thank you. This work matters. The research has provided helpful insight into the experience of women in the Evangelical Church in Canada, and I do believe it'll be a beneficial baseline for further study and future study. I've been part of evangelical churches for my entire life, the majority in the Christian Missionary Alliance in Canada, or the Alliance Canada for short. I'm also a pastor's wife, and for the last nearly 12 years, have been part of a denominational district team that oversees and supports Alliance churches and leaders in BC and Yukon. These combined experiences have afforded me a bit of a unique lens and experience in both church settings and ministry leadership in a number of different spaces. So as I read the research, there were many points where I thought, this is it. This is capturing what I've experienced or know what other women have experienced and shared with me. So thinking with that in mind, I'd like to offer a few reflections on the research and some considerations for how what has been learned could inform our understanding, our care, and engagement of women in the church. So Lindsay spoke to the differing understanding of the terms of complementarian and egalitarian, and I would agree that this binary of language we've used in Western evangelical theological conversations is far more nuanced in reality. There's a wide spectrum of theological understanding and practice, from strong complementarian stance to a strong egalitarian stance. It's a wide range. As the research showed, varying interpretations of each term are also shaped by the social imaginary and impacted women's conclusions about participation in the church. It seems that how a specific theological stance or conviction is interpreted by the church's leader or perhaps leadership will likely heavily influence the leadership paradigm, its functioning, the church's functioning rather, and ministry practices of a church. I often find myself in my work explaining what complementarian and egalitarian mean in context when speaking with church leaders or congregants, because living this out looks different in nearly every setting. There's some complementarian churches that, apart from having women as, not allowing women as elders, or having a female lead pastor, they function with men and women in all other areas of leadership. Functionally, that presents perhaps some confusion for some people. There are egalitarian churches who have allowed women to serve as elders for many years, but have never had a woman do so. So again, the labels don't necessarily describe what's happening in practice. And the result of varying theological interpretations and practices means that there's confusion for women. So what are the boundaries in the church that apply to them in terms of ministry, participation, and leadership? Are there restrictions that they need to be aware of so they don't step on a landmine? If the lead pastor or the board of elders hold a specific theological stance, is it clearly communicated to the congregation? Are they aware? Do they understand the implications for leadership in the church? Is it reflected in church policies? Sometimes practice includes not just formal policies, but informal policies as well. So there's a dissonance here for women that the research also bears out. Women need clarity on how they're able to participate in the life and the ministry of the church. Excuse me. I will say that while complementarian churches seem to be more often labeled as being unclear in communicating what women can and cannot do in a church, in my experience, it's actually egalitarian churches where women experience more hurt and confusion. They run into invisible barriers or unspoken expectations. And this has included pastors who believe they're egalitarian, yet their actions may not always line up with an interpretation of what that means in practice. And for, as Lindsay identified, for women who are in ministry roles, vocational ministry roles, that presents even greater challenge. There seems to be at times also a fear for some church leaders to do the deep theological work on diving into the role of men and women. What does the Bible say? Where do they land in their theological convictions? And how does that then impact their participation in ministry? So some have done this, and the challenge is for them then to articulate perhaps what that means in their church setting. They may hold that very tight to the chest, so to speak. And the lack of understanding and clarity, regardless of where a person lands on their theological stance, I would argue that in the church, when there's a lack of clarity, women pay the higher cost. It's typically women who are restricted or women who don't have clarity on what they can and cannot do. That lack of clarity, I think, also adds to a diminishment of women in their own confidence and understanding of how they can contribute well to the life of the church. For women in ministry leadership roles, and I've experienced this myself, a lack of clarity not only impacts church participation, how do you do your job well? It's challenging to try and gauge what's okay to do, what's maybe perhaps stepping on some toes, or where is there a space that you really shouldn't step into? And that's one that's really challenging because you typically only find that out when you've stepped into something and gone, oh, that was wrong, or that was bad, and I'm not even entirely sure why. Or a dynamic shifts in a room and you don't know why. So this makes the ministry role feel unsteady, and I think can contribute to a longer, deeper lack of confidence in a woman's leadership. It's difficult to know what advancement is allowed and places where there appears to be opportunity, but perhaps that's really only in theory or on paper. Denominations perhaps where there's no formal or explicit restriction on senior level leadership, yet to actually function as a woman in that space would virtually be impossible. there'd be a significant portion of churches or church leadership who would immediately not respect or uphold that leadership, or have a theological conviction that means they can't abide by that. So it immediately causes conflict. Is that clear? Is that known? How do we deal with those spaces? So with all of this said, here's a few questions for further reflection on that. If you're in a position of church leadership, have you personally wrestled through your theological convictions on the roles of women and men in church? If you have, I would encourage you to consider how that theological stance impacts ministry leadership, impacts church participation, and church governance. And this is for men and women. Do the practices and structure of your church align to the stance that you hold, to the space that you have in your denomination? Perhaps you're like me, where we in the Alliance Canada hold space for people and churches to hold either a complementarian or egalitarian stance. And yet within that spectrum, as we've already said, there's a wide range of how that can be lived out in the church setting. Within your, theological framework, how are men and women fully released for kingdom work? Are the people in your church aware of your church's approach? Is there anywhere that clarity could or should be sought? Clarity is kindness. Clarity is helpful. Clarity reduces conflict. We need to bring clarity wherever we can, because it's really a matter of care for people in the church. Related to this is the matter of safety that the research spoke to. And I resonated with the findings that safety was not simply a physical matter, a physical issue of harm, perhaps, although that's very important. But it's also about feeling valued and trusted and heard in the church as a woman. A quote by one of the research partners, and apologize if I'm saying her name wrong, but Marie-Josée Fortin struck me. Said, "I have often observed that what women mostly want is not to be in a leadership position, but mostly to be heard." Amen. That is my experience. That is the experience of many women that I have either worked with, led with, cared for in the church. They want to be heard. They want to know that their voice matters, that it holds value. Safety is broader than perhaps what we typically consider in the church. And safety and risk management for children, for youth, for vulnerable persons is vital. But for women, it's also about creating an environment where they're valued, where they're seen as being made in the image of God. Their input and contributions are invited and appreciated, and their voices are listened to. In the church and as leaders, are we willing to listen to what women have to say? Are we treating them as sisters in Christ with dignity? Are they approached as being trustworthy and of value, with gifts and skills that provide a reflection of God, of who He is, for the greater good of the body? Where there are theological differences, as church leaders, how are we inviting women to speak to perceived gaps between practice and policy? I think of spaces where women, perhaps for the first time, are invited to participate on a board. They're an elder. They don't know. No one's gone before them to do this in their church. Are we inviting and willing to hear of their experience, of the challenges, of the good? Are we willing to invest disproportionately to invite them into those spaces? In other spaces where perhaps that's restricted for women to participate, are we finding spaces where women still can participate fully within what is considered allowed in their theological paradigm? Are their voices able to identify those strengths that the church may benefit from, as Lindsay identified? Women have clearly desires and hopes and dreams and good ideas to benefit the church as a whole. We need to invite their voices into that space. I think the research also presents us with a helpful understanding of differences generationally in participation and engagement for women in the church. And one particular aspect that stood out to me was that younger generations are attending church primarily because of community, whereas older generations still definitely enjoy community, but would lean more so towards the preaching, teaching, and doctrinal alignment side of things. And so I've wondered how larger cultural shifts impact here. Things like the influence and rise of social media over the recent years, the impact of the pandemic on communities and connections, especially on young adults who, for a number of years at these key times in their life, were so lonely or siloed. And shifts in family life, people are marrying later and having fewer or if any children, and how all this aligns to what we're seeing in the shifts in our church. Like, as leaders, are we paying attention to generational shifts and recognizing the impacts on those who are part of our communities? Are we not just thinking through what's happening, but how are we thinking through a Christian lens? That we're processing this through our foundation of scriptural truth. And how are our church ministries being shaped to reach the needs of women in various life stages? If our church is focused on a heavy teaching and we aren't actually building into care and community, we may miss an entire generation of young adult women. And we actually may miss something for the older generations of a larger sense of community that perhaps this younger generation has something to teach the older as well. A related observation to this that showed in the research is the participation by women in the life of the church has historically been high, and in areas primarily related to care and nurturing aspects. But in recent decades, we've seen a shift to more front-facing platform-type roles and an increase in teaching positions. In Alliance churches, for example, I've seen an increase in women participate on church boards, growth in women in ministry roles, although that's still, compared to men, relatively small, an increase in church leadership, and yet there still remains a sense that it's increasingly challenging to get women to participate. And so while I would agree there are larger cultural shifts here that impact participation in the life of the church, such as women needing to work, and life stages impacts that as well. I think that there's the clarity to ability, sorry, I'm backing up. Too many sentences at one time. The clarity is needed on the ability to participate in certain roles also, as we mentioned earlier. But I think we need to consider how women are approached to participate in various church ministries and leadership roles. So in light of that, I wanted to offer a few suggestions that may be helpful for you as you engage with women and recruit them for participation in the church. And this links to women being heard and other things as well that we've talked about in the research. So consider the visible leaders that women might see in your church. Are there women serving or who have served previously in the roles that you're recruiting for? Is there someone that other women could seek information from or talk to about their experience, someone where they could give them insight? You may most likely need to provide a direct ask rather than a public one. Speaking one-on-one with and providing women with not only a description of the role, but clarity on their fit and how you see their skills and gifts contributing well is really helpful. You may need to encourage them. This is why I think you'd be amazing here. You may need to ask women more than one time to consider the role and provide them time to process the ask. Adding pressure to a request to serve when a woman is facing a lack of clarity is a very challenging position to be in. Consider the ask from her perspective. Is there more information she may need? Is she going to need information you may not normally need to consider the same ask? Is she free to say no? Or to question if the role may need to be changed slightly, made more flexible to accommodate family life or other commitments? And offer to provide support and follow through, not just to get them on a team or in a role, but also as they serve and find their way into a new space. And I would encourage you to learn from them, especially if this is a space where a woman has not served previously. They have something to speak to how that team works, how this functions in your church, and how other women may how they're paving the way for the women behind them so that other participation may grow. And so lastly, a couple minor thoughts, probably Lindsay, to throw at you. The research brought up a few other curiosities for me. And so I'd really be curious to see how a similar study of men's experience in the church compared. I think that would give us a fulsome understanding of a larger picture. And one of the things that I would really love to learn about, Canada is an increasingly diverse country, multi-ethnic. There's a lot of intercultural fluency, I think, that we need to gain in our evangelical churches, because the reality is the vast majority of our churches are already multicultural. So the impact of high and low cultures and how that mixes in the church, and how we hear from women who may not be, of Caucasian or primarily Western culture perspective, would be really helpful. I think we have a lot to learn there. Personally, I know I would have a lot to learn there and love to learn more from that. And then I just appreciate that this is a baseline. So I'm curious to see in the future a comparison, like how shifts are impacting the church, and how we can continue as a wider evangelical church to learn from this initial study. So I want to again express my thanks to the research team for the good work completed here. And it's my hope and prayer that this sparks further conversations in the church.
Wonderful. Again, virtual clapping for Erin. Thank you so much for your response and sharing those thoughts, and the clear time that you took to go through in such detail this project. This is wonderful, and have responses to it. So we will take a couple moments now to open up the conversation. There have been some questions in the Q&A box. I will probably have to choose a few selectively, but if your question is not answered, hopefully you may be able to stick around in the after party here and perhaps get the chance to converse with a researcher or respondent. One of the main things I wanted to highlight here, there's been a request if you might be able to post in the chat where the full report will be published. I don't know if you have that link on hand, Lindsay, but that would probably be helpful. Amazing, you are on it. And another question here, I will pull this one. Governance across the denominations remains predominantly male in the evangelical world. Why are men positioned as the final arbiters of women's roles, and how is the restriction or removal of women's agency justified? Perhaps we'll start there. Lindsay, take it away.
That's a banger of a first question.
Oh boy.
I think there are several influences that shape that kind of structure. One being just historically, positions held historically, and then also this maybe, as we kind of identified, a certain lens to understanding and interpreting the scripture. There's also a lot of cultural factors that factor in. Erin probably has more perspective on this as somebody like from within the ministry realm. I do this more in a research capacity, but I don't know. I think just structurally how society is structured and everything, it's just the way that the thing that it is. That's a terrible, there's just so much to that. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Erin.
No, I think you're right. That is a banger of a question. You're right. It's a good question, whoever asked that. I think you're right. There are historical pieces. I don't know if anyone has read Jesus and John Wayne, but yeah, that's a wonderful book and very enlightening in terms of the cultural, historical shifts of evangelicalism, especially in the 20th century, that impacted that. And so I think there's a lot of history that comes into it. I mean, you think of the change in women outside of church just culturally in the last 50, 60 years. In some ways, we're just behind that in the church and in terms of our governance. And so, like even in the Alliance, for example, our default posture is complementarian. And yet, that's probably because that's historical from when in the 70s and 80s, that was just how everything was. So it was assumed, both a theological and a historical and a cultural adding together. And then it takes time to really change structure, like to change your governance structure and actually shift you have to be willing to have the conversation. You have to have a theological and a practical conversation. That takes time. That takes willingness. That takes, you're talking about hard stuff sometimes, deeply held convictions.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and if I could add, I mean, I guess in some of my conversations with women 60 and older, you saw remnants of an imagination of a previous time, maybe where they would say, I don't think men even want to be pastored by a woman, or I don't think men want to be led by a woman. And none of that was, even if a younger person held to a complementarian stance, they didn't locate it in that same area. So I think we even see the reasoning and justification changing for why they might reinforce a certain structure. The reasons are changing, and a lot of them are unsure what to do with the role of culture in shaping what the church does. So one woman who actually moved from a very conservative, like she called it like a fundamentalist church, to a complementarian evangelical church. Those are the words she used. She said, in my fundamentalist church, we were capitulating to a culture, but a culture from 100 years ago. And so she found it very freeing in a complementarian church. So I think there are again, different lenses and imaginaries that a one size fits all kind of solution isn't really going to work.
And I think people do default as well to their, like, the social imaginary, like, what do they know? What have they seen? And so, even if there's a shift and they're on a journey, perhaps in theological evaluation, there's a tendency to default to what's known before you make that shift. And so even at a larger, governance level, at a denominational level, that's also evident. So it takes time.
I might just layer in one other question here because it may be somewhat related. There's a question around whether these issues of safety that you both raised in the church and that the study raises might be hindering women's kind of full participation or creating a hesitancy to participate maybe at higher leadership levels or in general. And how do we acknowledge that reality in our church's histories? And so the silence on the church's part probably does not help women feel safe, is a comment made in amongst this question as well. So I'm not sure if you want to add any thoughts on that, and then we'll probably have to move towards our networking time. But yeah, does the safety factor play any role here?
Sure. Yeah, well, one thing that I'll just say that I didn't get into is that we did have a subset of women who no longer attend church that we were able to survey, which is there were about 100 of them, about 5% of our sample. And among the top 3 reasons for why they no longer attend church, safety was cited as a reason. For women who do attend church, safety wasn't listed in in the top 10 reasons for why they do attend. So we think there is this understanding that women at least feel tacitly safe when they are attending church. And it could be that, I mean, again, it's a very small sample, but it could be that the ones who feel unsafe are no longer there.
Yeah, and I would argue, like, it is very challenging, and I would say I've done this because I've a few spaces that I've stepped into senior level leadership has been very challenging, especially because no one's done it before. I'm in a role that has never had a woman in it in our denomination, and so I'm so grateful for that. And yet it's been bumpy at times, and I'm grateful that I work on a team right now where I'm supported, I'm free to do my job well, I have clarity, all of those things. But it's taken time. And yet if I were to, step into perhaps another senior level leadership role above that, there's not a lot of clarity. And I already know there's spaces where that just would not work practically. It'd be very hard. So I think there's barriers in terms of silence from, top down. I think there's perhaps confusion on, like, how would that practically work? Is there space for you? Would you be supported if you stepped into that leadership? And then when you're the first one to do it, as a woman, you have that feeling of, like, I have to do this right. Because if I get it wrong, it affects everyone's choices and opportunities moving forward. That's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure to get it wrong, feels enormous. So the weight, the combination, the lack of clarity, like that's a powerful mix to prevent someone from stepping up into a leadership role like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of kind of the concept for broader organizations of the glass ceiling. Even when formal boundaries are removed theoretically for women to achieve upper level positions within a variety of organizations, right? There still are some of these more latent struggles, barriers that you
Stained
can't.
glass ceiling.
Stained glass ceiling, yes, that you
Yeah.
sometimes see or can't see, right? Like the idea of glass, you still hit your head against it.
Yeah.
Wow. But Erin, you are doing this. You are shaping the cultural imaginary of your denomination and the church more broadly by being where you are. And Lindsay, you're doing incredible things to illuminate where the glass is, if that makes sense. You're shedding light on the glass. So thank you both so much for this incredible conversation today. We have to move towards closing our time together and moving into the networking. This has been wonderful. Again, our thanks to Lindsay and Erin for presenting today. Our thanks to everyone who raised questions. Next week, we'll send this recording around to everyone who registered, so you can post the link if you'd like on social media channels or share with others within your congregations and ministry settings and research settings. Also, in our commitment to provide Canadian data for Canadian church leaders, we do provide many other resources on our website at the Flourishing Congregations Institute that you can access from the QR code on the screen or find at www.flourishingcongregations.org. Please visit our website, sign up to receive the Flourishing Forward feature, a twice per month communication featuring lots of new Canadian data like what you heard today, the cutting edge of understanding a variety of different aspects of congregational life. So if you are interested in joining us for the 15-minute post-webinar networking discussion, feel free to remain in the Teams meeting now. If you are unable to stay, this is your time if you need to head out. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will say goodbye to those who need to leave at this moment.